If you enjoy these programs, please like and subscribe. Monotheism, while today makes a lot of sense, in the ancient world it was nonsense. No one but the Jews were monotheists.
Paul and Christianity, their elevation of Jesus to God and a divine being or whatever, they try to use like Genesis 1, let us make man in our own image, and some other passages. And there was a book on the two powers heresy, where there was I guess there was
Siegel.
discarded or rejected view of a second power. How do you deal with the let us make God man in our own image and the Christian views where they tried to deify Jesus?
So as it turns out, Paul never touches Genesis 1:26. Man, in the view of the Torah, is binary. He's both made up of the clay, the dust of the earth, like other creatures. As it turns out, we are literally made up of stardust. And he also possesses the Spirit of God, which is breathed into him, Genesis chapter 2. He's both. He's the only creature like that. That means angels are metaphysical. Animals are only physical, but have no neshama, have no soul. God, when creating man in Genesis 1:26, summons both. He summons both the earth and the angels, or what the angels are made of, and produces man. That's why it's let us make man in our image. Christians are in an unenviable predicament because they're trying to produce polytheism from Tanakh, and Tanakh is not a fertile ground for that, is unsupportive of that. So they marshal such ambiguous texts. And Genesis 1:26, unless you're familiar with the context, it's going to get past you. We see later on in Genesis 3:22, later, only 2 chapters later, where God again is addressing angels and says that if a man eats from the tree of life, he'll become like one of us, same phrase. So man is binary. That's why only the angels are summoned for the creation of man. They're not summoned for the creation of light, for the creation of earth, animals, other animals. None of that, only man, because man is both. But that's not in the Christian Bible. The academic world is different. The academic world, the secular academic world, has a problem. There's maybe a little complicated. I'll try to make it simple. Monotheism, while today makes a lot of sense, because we know the science, we know it's all the same stuff. In the ancient world, it was nonsense. And as it turns out, no one but the Jews were monotheists. No one was. Monotheism was exclusively we'll call it a Jewish domain. In the ancient world, during the first temple, there were no monotheists except for the Jews. Now, secular scholars, meaning historians, they've got a problem. I mean, if they don't bring God into this, they have to explain how did the Jews happen to stumble on monotheism. So from our view, the trajectory is very simple. Adam was a monotheist. Noah was a monotheist. But as time went on, the monotheism was corrupted, and then people started placing devices or intermediaries between God and man because God is inaccessible. What happened is that monotheism was the first iteration of theism. That's how it all began. And then man corrupted that. But for the secular world that's non-theistic, this is troubling because it would have been counterintuitive for people to believe in one God first. Why? Because things just seem different. The planets were synchronized perfectly. Water just seemed very different than fire. Just everything seemed different. People died for no apparent reason. People were in pain. for inexplicable reasons. Some women were able to conceive and others were not, and some died on the birthing stool. People mostly in the ancient world died of infections in their teeth. People didn't know that. So it seemed like there were just all these forces all over the place. There were gods who were competing with each other. Well, we can loosely call this a dualistic world. Dualistic. That means there was a good power, that's like the good God, and the God of this world who was a demiurge. This is really Neoplatonic thinking, but it's not like it came out of nowhere. So the secular academic world would always seeks, this is not Siegel's invention, always seeks to explain that the Israelites were originally pagans. And then monotheism was just this anomaly that suddenly emerged, and it took hold. And somehow, and secular scholars argue over this, of when this happened. This happened 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. They can't get it straight because they're basically, they start with the premise that it was invented. And the question is who invented it? When was it invented? Was it invented 3,300 years ago in the Bronze Age, late, middle? They're all over the place on this. But here's what's key, is that it had to have been invented. Why? Because as I said to you, monotheism could not have come first if there's no God. Why? Because it didn't make sense. Now we know that hydrogen is the most plentiful element in the universe. They didn't know that. They didn't know what hydrogen was. People didn't know what oxygen was 1,000 years ago. They didn't know any of these things. They didn't know what microbiology. They didn't understand any of this. So therefore, monotheism seems to have been, in the ancient world, from the vantage point of the non-theistic world, as a kind of a breakaway, sort of just this unusual breakaway from what everyone else thought. And if that's the case, you then want to find traces of that in Tanakh. You want to find some forensic evidence of this in the Hebrew Bible that will reflect a pagan beginning. It's very critical. It's a little sophisticated. So what they do then is they look in the Hebrew Bible when angels are called God in Tanakh. It's just the way it is. People are not familiar with Tanakh. They don't know any of this. And in fact, all the powers in the world are called Al. All of them are. They're all called Al. And Elohim, the name Elohim for the true God means that all the powers are really coming from one source. But even angels and judges and prophets are called God in Tanakh. Now, if you know this, you're not going to get messed up because you understand the context. You speak Hebrew. But very few people really speak Hebrew. Even the people called scholars, unless they're Old Testament scholars, they don't speak Hebrew. Very rare. Very, very rare. So this becomes the standard fare in scholarship. That, all these references to powers, that must be a unveiled reference to really the original Israelite gods that came from the Canaanites. And people who are atheists love this stuff. They're all over this stuff. So all you have to do in the scholarly world, like if you want to, this is also, in the scholarly world, in the biblical scholarly world, in order to make a name for yourself, you have to say something that's not traditional, that's not orthodox. Because if you say anything that's traditional, then it's not striking and you're a nobody, you're nothing. But if you say something that's revolutionary, that's new, your book gets published and your ideas get taught and you get interviewed. So there's an incentive in the academic world to say stuff like this. So if I were part of this world, all I have to do is look in the Hebrew Bible for references to God in the plural, powers in the plural. You can then make the case that the original Israelites were in fact pagans who adopted ideas from the Canaanites, and then somebody at some stage came up with the idea that there's one God, and that became the theory that everyone went with, and the other ideas fell away. That's really where it all comes from. If you, the viewer, gets what I just said, you now understand what's really going on. There are two competing ideas, and that is the secular academic world a priori believes that the tribe of the Jews were pagans and believed what the Canaanites believed. But somehow monotheism was an evolutionary process where something emerged and it somehow became an advantage and the other things fell away. That's how they view it. From the view of the religious community is no, monotheism was the original and paganism was a bastardization of a true belief. And I say this to you guys in the academic world. If you want to get published, go with the idea that the Judaism really began pagan and find things for it in the text, and that's where you'll get your interviews, and the New York Times will write all about you. Really very simple. If you enjoy these programs, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with others. Shalom.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא